The desert teaches patience.
Welcome back to Military Hub. I was present when we discovered him naked, except for his socks, leaning against the bodies of fallen soldiers as though merely sleeping. But this was no slumber. His chest and head were punctured by bullets. His brother Tom lay eviscerated beside him, his scalp ripped from his skull. We informed the world that Custer died courageously, untainted by the surrounding horror. That was a falsehood. We deceived his widow. We deceived the public. And now you are about to learn the reason why. On this battlefield, bodies were defiled. Men were mutilated past the point of identification. This is the concealed narrative of the events following Custer's final stand. For the triumphant Lakota and Cheyenne, the initial phase involved plundering their defeated foes. The American soldiers possessed valuable items, which now became the property of the victors, just as the soldiers would have done had the situation been reversed. Weapons, jewelry, uniforms, badges, and even deserted horses were seized. Lakota warrior Brave Bear recalled there was much arguing and dispute over the captured horses and firearms. The Indians were telling one another, "I have some tobacco. I have coffee. I have a fine gun." To the warriors, the spoils of war were a justly earned prize. Yet this procedure was savage for the deceased. Almost everyone was stripped of their clothing and left uncovered under the scorching sun. In several instances, feet were severed to remove boots more readily. The Lakota and Cheyenne traditionally took scalps from slain enemies, and this battlefield proved no different. For hours, warriors collected scalps from the dead as war trophies. Women also participated in the desecration. Cheyenne women later stated they had thrust awls into Custer's ears. Years later, it came to light that someone had forced an arrow into a humiliating part of Custer's body, a detail the army suppressed to shield his widow. As recounted by Lakota warrior Ironhawk, some of Custer's men feigned death, but were discovered by women scouring the battlefield. He remembered seeing two older women strip a soldier and start to dismember him, at which point the man sprang up and struggled against them. They promptly killed him. But Ironhawk confessed he found the spectacle of a naked man fighting two elderly women oddly amusing. Not everyone was laughing. Reportedly, Sitting Bull himself was disturbed. His visions had guaranteed victory, but cautioned of a curse if the dead were molested. Whether he genuinely objected to the mutilations remains unclear. Because reports of his statements emerged years afterwards, he may have been dissociating himself from acts criticized by outsiders. Meanwhile, the conflict was not over. A significant portion of the 7th Cavalry remained alive under Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, entrenched on what would be called Reno Hill. Sitting Bull's warriors harried them through the night of June 25th and all through June 26th, finally disengaging on the morning of June 27th when scouts announced the approach of U.S. reinforcements. Reno and Benteen had been too occupied with their frantic defense to know Custer's fate. It was General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibbon's troops who revealed the full extent of the catastrophe. Scouts initially chanced upon bloodied U.S. officers' uniforms in an emptied, looted camp abandoned when Sitting Bull's warriors retreated. Shortly after, another scout brought graver news. "I have tallied 197 dead bodies lying in the hills." When questioned if there were white men, he answered, "Yes, white men." Terry and Gibbon instantly understood a disaster had occurred. They dreaded the entire 7th Cavalry had been wiped out, but their scouts soon found Reno and Benteen survivors. Terry and Gibbon rushed to meet them, discovering them bruised but living. Both officers had presumed Custer had deserted them in pursuit of personal glory. Instead, they learned his destiny. Benteen and a detachment of his men were dispatched to find Custer. The sight they encountered was appalling. The corpses of their comrades were decomposing after 2 days in the Montana heat. They first encountered the bodies of Company L, commanded by Custer's brother-in-law, Lieutenant James Calhoun, still positioned in the defensive line where they had died at Calhoun Hill. In other areas, the dead were dispersed, either killed while fleeing or dragged after death. Another group of bodies was located on the slope that would be named Last Stand Hill. Private Jacob Adams was the first to notice the fallen commander. He summoned Captain Benteen, who verified, "By God, that is him." Custer's body was discovered near the hill summit, just 20 feet from his brother Tom. Like the others, he had been stripped naked, save for his socks. Unlike Tom, he had not been scalped. His body was arranged as if sitting against other soldiers, his expression eerily calm, almost asleep. Lieutenant James Bradley later wrote that roughly 200 additional bodies from Custer's command were strewn between the hills and the river near Sitting Bull's deserted camp. In a letter, he comforted the public that the fallen had not been severely mistreated, that mutilations were few, but this was untrue. Private Charles Windolph later conceded Bradley's words were meant to protect grieving families. In reality, the mutilations were horrific. Some bodies were disfigured beyond words. Isaiah Dorman, the Black Scout, had been so terribly violated that a kettle of his blood was left next to him as a taunt. Most soldiers had been scalped, filled with arrows, or bludgeoned with axes and war clubs after death. Officially, Custer's body exhibited only 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and one to the head, either potentially fatal, plus a knife wound on his thigh. But the more degrading particulars, like the arrow violation, were intentionally omitted from the record to protect Libby Custer. Tom Custer's fate was worse. Scalped, his skull shattered, and disemboweled. He could only be recognized by a tattoo on his arm. 2 days in the summer heat had left the bodies already decaying, the stench intolerable. Colonel Gibbon confessed the scene was overwhelming, and survivors never forgot it. Some later maintained that everyone on Last Stand Hill was dead when reinforcements came, but Private Adams remembered something else. Amid the corpses, he and others detected a faint sound. It came from a survivor, a horse. It was Comanche, a bay belonging to Captain Keogh, lying wounded but alive next to his deceased rider. Hit by several bullets and arrows, dehydrated and spent, the horse had survived days without aid, yet had stayed near Keogh's body. Soldiers promptly attended to him. Although other horses lived through the battle, Comanche's suffering and lone presence on Last Stand Hill made him an emblem. He healed, became the 7th Cavalry's mascot, and lived until 1891, honored with a full military burial. On June 27th, soldiers tallied and attempted to identify the dead. Many could not be named for sure. 19 bodies were never located. Over subsequent years, remains kept being discovered in the hills, implying some soldiers escaped the hill only to be pursued and killed later. The next morning, June 28th, the burials commenced. Benteen counted 208 dead. Bradley counted 206. In any event, time was scarce and peril remained. Fearing another assault, the soldiers dug shallow mass graves or interred men where they had fallen. Custer and Tom were placed together in a temporary grave at the bottom of the hill, wrapped in canvas with stones arranged to prevent scavenging. Who actually dug the grave is still disputed, with several men later asserting the honor. By nightfall, the burials were finished. General Terry was anxious to depart. 50 wounded required urgent attention, and news of the disaster had to reach headquarters. The column marched toward the Bighorn River, where the steamer Far West was waiting. En route, medics cared for the wounded as possible. amputating limbs when needed, though some still perished on the journey. For the survivors, the psychological damage was profound. Major Reno numbed his anguish with alcohol, buying 11 gallons of whiskey within weeks of his return. Captain Benteen also resorted to drink, later arguing with Captain Thomas Weir, who accused him of deserting Custer. He challenged him to a duel, which Weir refused. Consumed by guilt, Weir died later that year in his New York hotel room. Meanwhile, the Far West raced down the Missouri River carrying 38 wounded and the catastrophe news. In less than 3 days, it covered 710 miles back to Fort Abraham Lincoln, setting speed records. At dawn on July 6th, Libby Custer woke to the sound of the ship's docking. Hours later, officers broke the news to her and her sister-in-law, Maggie. Both women collapsed in sorrow. Libby, married to George for 12 years, had been his childhood sweetheart. The officers recalled the moments as unendurable, their sobs and tears beyond solace. Yet Libby swiftly turned to obligation, joining them to comfort the 26 other widows at the fort. For the remainder of her life, Libby Custer protected her husband's memory, faulting Reno and Benteen for the catastrophe until her death in 1933. The public first heard of the defeat on July 7th, merely 3 days after celebrating America's centennial. The stunning news commanded the press, igniting arguments over responsibility, Custer's impulsiveness, Reno and Benteen's shortcomings, or both. The nation was left shocked, grieving one of the most severe defeats ever inflicted on the U.S. Army by native warriors. The tragedy is not just that hundreds of men perished that day, but that their deaths were swiftly transformed into myth, their agony eased to spare families and to uphold reputations. What does it reveal about a nation when the truth of its most significant battlefield loss must be hidden beneath carefully constructed falsehoods? Was Custer remembered as a hero, or was he crafted into one? That is a disquieting truth history bequeaths to us. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel to view more fascinating history videos like this one. Thank you for watching.